Eyes on this program to the hidden city. New York City, America's biggest city, America's most important city, has a hidden city within the city. The hidden city is hiding in plain sight. The hidden city has a population of 700,000 people. That's larger than Boston. That's larger than Washington, D.C. Those 700,000 people live in federally funded public housing projects in New York City. They live in a hidden city of their own, ignored by most politicians. 4 years ago, after he gave viewers of this program an up-close look at the hidden city, Ritchie Torres pressured the Democratic presidential candidates, Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, to visit public housing projects in New York City. He was then the youngest member of New York City's city council at 28 years old. Tuesday night, Ritchie Torres came out ahead in the vote count in the Democratic primary for New York's 15th congressional district in the Bronx. The results won't be official until all the mail-in ballots are counted. And if Ritchie Torres is sworn in by Speaker Pelosi as a member of the House of Representatives in January, he will become a voice in Congress for the hidden city, for all of the hidden cities all over this country. 4 years ago, when we spent the day together in the Bronx, Ritchie Torres talked about growing up in the hidden city. You grew up in public housing in the Bronx. Tell us about that.
So I grew up in a public housing development in the East Bronx, known as Throgs Neck Houses, which is part of its own tale of two cities. It's right across the street from Trump Golf Course. Mm-hmm. And I grew up facing many of the same conditions that are facts of life here in public housing. Never-ending mold, leakage, and which was a difficult thing as an asthmatic growing up in public housing. Without the New York City Housing Authority, my mother, who raised 2 children on a low-wage job, would have been in a homeless shelter. She would have been among the 60,000 individuals in our shelter system. And so I'm indebted to public housing for giving me a fighting chance at a decent life and becoming the youngest member of the city council.
And here's how Ritchie Torres made his case to Bronx voters in his congressional campaign.
I have conducted investigations into Kushner Companies, held the first ever city council hearing in a public housing development, which ultimately led to a $3 billion FEMA grant. I want my neighbors to stay in the Bronx. There's no one who fights harder for us in Washington, D.C. I'm not a miracle worker, but I'm a fighter. And I'm going to fight my heart out to ensure that the Bronx gets its fair share.
Joining us now, New York City Council member Ritchie Torres, who seems to be well on his way to Washington. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. The campaign was a difficult one. You were been an openly gay candidate in New York City for years now, and you were running against a real homophobic politician who, in that crowded field, had a chance of squeaking out the victory. Was that a significant part of the campaign dynamic?
It was the core dynamic in the campaign. So I was running in the most fiercely contested congressional primary in New York City. There were 12 candidates, including 5 elected officials. And as you pointed out, the front runner was a man by the name of Ruben Diaz Sr., who was known to be the most anti-LGBTQ, anti-choice, pro-Trump elected official in New York City. And even though the South Bronx is said to be the most Democratic district in America, it was a real risk that the bluest congressional seat could fall into the hands of a pro-Trump Republican masquerading as a Democrat. And many people said this race could not be won. Ruben Diaz Sr., a larger-than-life political figure, could not be beaten. And we proved the pundits wrong, and we achieved an improbable victory.
How did you do it? Because, as you say, it looked like it was going to go the other way.
We're living in a volatile political moment. This was a change election. I was a change candidate. And throughout the country, voters cast their ballot overwhelmingly for a new generation of leadership that reflects the mosaic of a multiracial democracy. It is gratifying for me because Ruben Diaz Sr. for decades has represented the politics of homophobia. And so the triumph of an openly LGBTQ congressional candidate represented to many long overdue poetic justice.
Tell us about what the coronavirus pandemic has done to the housing projects of New York City, the housing project you grew up in, your mother still lives in that project, and housing projects throughout the country?
Well, there's severe overcrowding of apartments, especially in public housing, and those overcrowded apartments often become petri dishes for the spread of an infectious disease like COVID-19. The South Bronx was struggling even before the outbreak of COVID-19, but the food insecurity, the health disparities, all of these have been taken to a new level, and it's revealed the deeper racial inequalities embedded in American society. And we need a federal government that's committed to addressing the root causes of racially concentrated poverty. The South Bronx is ground zero for racially concentrated poverty, and the federal government needs to address it.
Because you're a city politician, you're very close to the question of schools and kids going back to schools. What can you tell us tonight about New York City's expectation of kids going back to school at the end of August?
It's unclear. There's been no clear guidance on the mayor and how he's going to proceed. The mayor made a comment that students are not going to return fully to public schools until there's a vaccine. I'm in favor of some return to public schools with staggered schedules. I happen to think that face coverings are more effective than people originally thought. So I would advocate for return to normalcy with proper precautions.
Talk about the disparity between the kids that you represent, many of whom do not have an internet connection so that they can go to school remotely. New York City lost an awful lot of students who had no connection and ability to get wired in to the remote classroom.
Look, I represent students who live in shelters without access to the internet. The policy response to COVID-19 itself revealed disparities. The federal government was sending stimulus checks, but not everyone in my district has access to a bank account. There was talk of telemedicine and remote learning, but not everyone in my district, including those in shelters, have access to the internet. So even the policy response to COVID-19 was deeply unequal and unfair to a district like mine.
Ritchie Torres, thank you very much for joining us again tonight. We really appreciate it.
Of course, it was an honor to be here.
Thank you, Ritchie.